American fighter pilots struggled greatly to tell apart allies from enemies in Vietnam's jungles and rice paddies. To clear the confusion of battle, hundreds of FACs flew over the countryside in light, unarmed planes, identifying enemy spots with marker rockets and guiding follow-up air attacks. FACs didn't get the same attention as pilots flying fast, deadly fighter bombers, but much of the huge air war in Southeast Asia would not have been possible without their bold help. Few aerial combat roles were as risky, intense, and emotionally devastating as those flown by forward air controllers in Vietnam. The fighter bomber crews had a very hard time delivering close air support on their own. Skirmishes often began at very short range between small U.S. patrols and the hidden Viet Cong under thick, triple canopy jungle. The FAC's job was to assess the chaos from above and call in airstrikes to protect troops below. He did it armed only with radios, rockets, and raw courage.
I can only describe it as sheer chaos. And usually the forward air controller got called when everything was going steadily downhill. And the Army would try and control what they're doing with their command and control helicopters. And then when they get into it and they just find out, well, there's too much in here. We needed heavier firepower. They can't handle it with the gunships, or they can't handle it with artillery, or they just can't find the friendlies. That was the biggest problem, was in the jungle, under the jungles. Nobody knew where anybody was. Remember, we didn't have satellites and GPS, global positioning systems, or anything like that. You know, this was technology. This was reading a map and locating somebody on the map. And the maps were old. A lot of the maps we used were from the French.
The pressure was immense. Time was critical, but every choice a FAC made could mean life or death for the soldiers below. The fighter bomber crew's experience, their aircraft and weapon capabilities, and the precise location of friendly forces were only some of the elements that had to be weighed before calling in a strike. Adding to the stress, FACs constantly had to balance the danger of overreacting to desperate requests with the risk of casualties from hesitating.
Sometimes they wouldn't tell you how close it was. They would just say bomb the target, because they were in such dire straits that they needed air support and they needed it now. So you would ask them, you know, how close is this to you? They would say, don't worry about it. Just don't worry about it. Just put the bombs down.
FACs carried out many vital tasks in Vietnam, but for the pilots, none mattered more than close air support. Many FACs not only supported the ground troops, they often became genuine friends. The ties with U.S. Special Forces members were particularly strong. FACs assigned to these top-tier teams lived beside and consistently aided the small recon patrols day after day. John Flanagan was a FAC for Project Delta, a unit that regularly inserted small groups into extremely dangerous zones to observe enemy movements.
I knew them all by first name. I could recognize them. Their voices over the radio. You know, I know who they were. Although we used, you know, official call signs, but I had a beer with this guy. I knew his wife. I knew his children. I knew his girlfriend. I knew, you know, everything, where he was from. So it became a very, very personal type of war.
FACs deeply feared losing the men they were there to protect. They had a front row view of the action and did everything possible to avoid such a chilling outcome. Yet their special role often placed them squarely in the middle of the most dangerous situations imaginable. No one understood this more than John Flanagan. On December 2, 1966, he was dispatched to support a last resort mission to recover a Delta team that had mistakenly been dropped inside Laos. There were no fighters available, but when Flanagan finally located the team's exact spot, the scene looked stable enough for a Delta helicopter to attempt a fast extraction.
The North Vietnamese, they waited, well-disciplined troops. They waited until the helicopter just got into the hover, and they opened up. and it was an ambush. They had sucked the helicopter in an ambush, and they started transmitting on the radio, we're taking fire, and I could hear the slugs from the AK-47s. I could hear them hitting the helicopter. You could hear them going through the metal. And then you hear the door gunners with their M60 machine guns firing back, hammering back, and I got on the radio, and I said, get out of there, get out of there.
These dire moments pushed Flanagan and many other FACs to risk it all. They were the lifeline, the final glimmer of hope for terrified men pinned down below. But so were the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese aware of that. Once it was clear the pilots of those old, little aircraft were much more than observers, the slow-moving FACs became top priority targets. Pilots did everything they could to stay alive. Many regularly called ground troops, hoping someone would find them if they were ever shot down. Some carried a mini arsenal of weapons, just in case they had to fight their way to safety. But in the end, these precautions did little to lower the grim casualty rates that FACs endured in Vietnam.
Typically, either went out and were never heard from again, or went out and got hit and went down, and we knew where they went down, but it was such a hot area by the time we got there, they were dead. People who live by the rules usually made it home okay. It's when you tried to do something extra, sometimes because you were trying to help somebody else on the ground, or were trying to show off, or were doing something else stupid. That's when people get hurt.
The long and complex story of forward air controllers in Vietnam began in a rather straightforward way. During the summer of 1963, the 19th Tactical Air Support Squadron, a single FAC unit, was created at Ben Hoa Air Base near Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. The squadron was part of the larger American plan to support and advise Vietnam in its battle against communist guerrillas known as the Viet Cong. FACs operated Cessna O-1s, light, compact spotting planes nicknamed Bird Dogs, armed with just a few radios and 4 rockets for making targets. Their assignment was to train South Vietnamese pilots to scout terrain, identify targets on the ground, and guide airstrikes to support friendly troops. At first, American pilots were only meant to stay in the country for 1 year to complete the training. But FACs remained in Southeast Asia far longer, and their mission grew significantly in scale and importance. In spring 1965, President Lyndon Johnson began sending large combat forces into Vietnam. The first group of Marines arrived at Da Nang that March. By late 1966, more than 385,000 U.S. troops were stationed across the region. As troop levels rose, American units began routinely clashing with Viet Cong forces in brutal gunfights. To support the growing combat role, Johnson sent hundreds of fighter jets to South Vietnam during 1965 and 1966. Their main objective was to deliver close air support for U.S. patrols encountering guerrilla fighters.
President Johnson decided the commitment to escalate the war in 1966. So the war came from being a Vietnamese war with American support to an American war fought in Vietnam. So with that, with the conventional forces coming into it, so came the air power, the jet fighter bombers. So they found out that here you had 450-knot fighter bombers trying to find targets in a close air support environment with friendly troops, and said, how are we going to do this? And this is where the forward air controller really came into his own, because he was the go-between between the ground forces and the fighter bombers.
In response to rising conflict, the Air Force formed 3 new tactical air support squadrons in spring 1965. Numerous other FACs also began operating under the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps, as well as South Vietnamese and Australian units. Due to the short range of bird dogs, most pilots flew alone from hundreds of crude makeshift airstrips across the country. Still, the core elements of their duties remained much the same. The top priority for every FAC was responding to urgent calls from troops in contact. Once overhead, the FAC created a mental image of the situation below by communicating with ground commanders and slowly circling for a closer look. Meanwhile, he started assessing the best available fire support options. FACs could coordinate several types of firepower, including helicopter gunships and artillery from both land and sea. But their main asset was air support. Fighter bombers from the Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps operating from bases in South Vietnam and Thailand, or from carriers in the Gulf of Tonkin and South China Sea were their primary resource. To call in an airstrike, FACs would contact the nearest Direct Air Support Center, or DASC. DASC controllers could launch a flight of alert fighters that were already armed, with engines running, and often pilots already in their seats. Alternatively, they could reroute a flight that was already in the air. In particularly critical situations, many FACs bypassed official command entirely.
You could have bombs on the target in as little as 3 minutes, 5 minutes. I mean, I've had it that close. I got in real trouble and I needed it. And well, a couple times I did. I stole the fighters. You know, I knew what their strike frequency was, and I got on it, and I just stole them from another forward air controller. He improvised. I said, "Hey, I got my trouble's worse than yours. We'll sort out the paperwork later."
It was surprisingly easy for fighter bomber crews to inadvertently respond to a radio call from the FAC while meeting with another, which could lead to disaster. To avoid this, most FACs developed various techniques, like rocking their wings to visually signal their identity.
3-5, are you going to left out of it? Go left, open. Okay, we got you. Thanks.
The FAC immediately contacted any responding fighters to confirm the number and type of aircraft available, their ordnance load, and how long each plane could stay on station. At the same time, they worked to maintain contact with tactical air control personnel and to pinpoint the locations of friendly forces on the ground.
So there's the forward air controller with 3 radios to which we could monitor all 3 of them at once. We could only transmit on them one at a time. So you're trying to fly the airplane, keep track of what's going on, and then flipping the wafer switch to select which radio you were going to transmit on. And you know, sometimes you'll forget to switch it and you're talking to the ground guys, and then all of a sudden fighters will come up and you'll forget to switch frequency, and the ground guys get confused. And then the real part of it starts the adrenaline pumping, is when the ground guys get on there and they start saying, we're hit, you know, or can you get us out of here? And you hear nothing but hand grenades and automatic weapons. I mean, your radios are just filled with a static of automatic weapons, M60 machine guns, M16 rifles, and you can always pick out the sound of an AK-47. But, you know, when you start hearing the enemy's weapons on your radio, you know you got problems.
FACs often requested ground commanders to release a canister of colored smoke to confirm their position. However, this tactic was risky, as the smoke also made it easier for enemy gunners to target them. To make matters worse, the Viet Cong often tried to trick the FACs into calling in airstrikes on friendly forces.
You never wanted to ask the friendlies to pop a particular kind of smoke, because if the enemy can hear that and they listen to our radios, then if you say, hey, give me yellow smoke, well, then the enemy pops yellow smoke too. Well, which one is it? So we would ask the friendly forces to pop smoke, and then once they would pop a smoke, we would say, okay, I have your green smoke, and they'd say, Roger, we're the green smoke. So now I know where they are.
Once a FAC had a clear understanding of the situation below, he rolled in on marked targets using white phosphorus rockets, known as Willie Pete's. This was by far the most dangerous part of a FAC's mission. Once enemy forces realized a FAC had spotted them, they typically aimed their weapons at the vulnerable pilot to prevent him from calling for support. The likelihood of hitting their target increased significantly as the pilot dove toward their position, then struggled to climb out of the danger zone. After a FAC laid down smoke, he would begin briefing the fighter pilots on how the strike should unfold, giving a clear picture of the target area, the desired approach angles, and where the heaviest enemy fire was coming from.
I'd like the first bomb just north of my smoke, about 100 meters. That's just a couple pistol whips. Okay. You still have my smoke? I got your smoke still, right? Battle 2 1 I'm hot in Paris. 2 roger. Oh, looks pretty good. I'd like you to keep your passes as steep as possible and be especially vigilant for helicopters.
The FAC carefully observed each pass the fighters made, ensuring their maneuvers did not endanger friendly forces below. They also had to be very well versed in the capabilities of different types of ordnance, which was crucial for determining how close bombs could be dropped to friendly positions.
When you're working your fighters around friendlies, you keep them under much tighter control. You watch every time they roll in. In many cases, if they didn't look right, you would tell them to go through dry. And let's set it up again. Let's do it right this time. These types of weapons are extremely destructive. And as an example, with a 500-pound bomb, a Mark 82, generally you wanted to have your friendlies at least 200 meters away from them because of the concussive blast of that. I mean, it'll take out your eardrums, definitely, when those bombs go off. Other types of ordnance that we would use, like napalm, you're going to get a splash effect from that, and you don't want to hit your friendlies with that. We had another weapon that we would use called cluster bomb units, or CBUs, and you would drop a bomb, a big clamshell would open, and you'd have hundreds of little bomblets that would float to the ground and explode over a wide area. Great for blowing up trucks and guns, but real dangerous around people, okay?
Nothing was more gratifying for a forward air controller than the response from troops saved by close air support. John Flanagan vividly remembers one such mission when an 8-man patrol accidentally encountered a much larger Viet Cong force and was pinned down by intense fire.
Guy was obviously very frightened. I mean, because his words ran together, his high-pitched tone of his voice, and oh boy. So here's a case where you've got to take control of the situation and find out where he is, where the fire is coming from, get the fighter bombers on the target. And this one was pretty close. We were working about 50 to 100 meters, friendlies. And as soon as we put that first can of napalm in there, it just changed. All of a sudden he comes, yeah, that's great. Go get him. Right on. More, more, more.
Flanagan was overhead and in communication with the desperate patrol leader within minutes. The quick and precise support provided by forward air controllers often changed the course of battle in mere seconds, saving countless American and Allied infantry lives. However, not every mission went as planned, and many close air support operations ended in tragedy. Yet the courage of FACs to risk everything earned them immense respect from American forces across Southeast Asia. As the Vietnam War escalated, more aircraft were needed to carry out crucial forward air control tasks. In 1964, plans for a faster, better armed aircraft were set in motion, but the new plane didn't arrive until 1968. In the meantime, the Cessna O-2 Skymaster was adopted as an interim solution, another civilian plane adapted for military use in 1967. The Skymaster's twin-engine push-pull system allowed FACs to respond more quickly to distant emergencies and perform better in high-risk areas. It also carried more marking rockets, added a bit of armor, and was equipped with a communication and navigation system that allowed fighters to pinpoint the FAC's position with ease. Despite these improvements, the Skymaster could never completely replace the hardy bird dogs, which continued to fly alongside the O-2 for most of the war. Next to assisting troops in contact, the FAC's primary role was conducting visual reconnaissance. Each day, hundreds of FACs patrolled specific sectors of the countryside in an effort to track down the elusive Viet Cong.
We would get real familiar with that particular area. That was my area. I knew all the waterfalls, all the trees, all the mud puddles, and which way the tracks went, and where the hooches were in that particular area. I got to know it real well where the fire bases were. And if we were just going on reconnaissance, we'd go and fly a pattern over that area and look for any instances of change from the last time we were there.
You know, all of a sudden the laundry starts turning up on the line in somebody's backyard. And we say, well, wait a minute, that laundry hasn't been there. Oh, you go down, you take a closer look. One look, all right? You don't go back, because then they'll have the guns out waiting for you. One look and you say, wow, there's a lot of male pajamas hanging on the line. And you hadn't seen any males in the area. Well, you knew that a Viet Cong unit was transiting the area.
Many FACs even descended to treetop level, scanning for enemy fire when something suspicious caught their attention. In this dangerous maneuver, the pilot essentially tried to provoke the Viet Cong into firing at his plane, hoping they would reveal their positions. When a significant target was discovered, FACs could immediately request a flight of fighter bombers. However, much of their reconnaissance was used in conjunction with other intelligence sources to identify targets for pre-planned airstrikes.
The pre-planned strike would be requested through the Army channels, and it would be from the day before. And it would go through this intricate network, through the Direct Air Support Center to the Tactical Air Control Center in Saigon, and then all the colonels would sit around and so we're going to have the big war, and they decide. And they start allocating, because the missions, they call frag orders, had to go back out to the fighter bases, and they would assign the fighters, say, okay, tomorrow at 10 o'clock you're going to go to this place, and this fighter mission at 11 o'clock goes here, and so on down the line, and here's the forward air controller. And so they'd match up with forward air controller, so the strike would be good. You know, nice if you got a nice orderly battle, right? You say, okay, you guys are, you Viet Cong, you have to attack at 10 o'clock, right? Because that's when we have our air power. Yeah.
The challenge was that by the time these planned strikes were carried out, there was often little or nothing of value left in the target area. Frag orders typically required pilots to execute the strike, no matter what they found when they returned to the area. Dave Albinson vividly recalls the frustration he felt during one mission when he decided to inspect the target for a pre-planned strike long before the fighter bombers arrived.
I went down and looked, and it was very precise location of a bend in the river. And there was nothing there. There was no hooch, there was no path, there was no evidence of any activity whatsoever. And I called back in, "Are you sure this is the location?" "Yes, da, 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 da." So the fighters showed up and I sent them home. I said, "We don't have anything here. Have you got a second location for us?" "No, this is it. This is the only location." I sent them home. Well, I was, when I got home, within 2 hours, I was in a brace in front of a colonel's desk for second guessing the frag. And it was very clear to me that there were consequences for not going by the book.
As the war continued, many FACs realized it would be nearly impossible to defeat the Viet Cong's guerrilla tactics using only air power. The VC became infamous for their hit-and-run raids, quickly disappearing back into the countryside.
Enemy forces were just absolutely tough. Remember, we were fighting on their terrain, in their jungles. their environment. The local Viet Cong knew every trail, knew every ambush site, every way station, everything. So we were at very much at a disadvantage.
Trying to use air power against small groups of men on the ground who can bury themselves in and escape is the wrong tool for the job. That's all there was to it.
The Viet Cong grew highly skilled at avoiding U.S. air power, but were equally determined to counter it. They knew that at close range, a single shot could send even the most advanced strike aircraft crashing to the ground in flames.
Very determined people. We got into some airstrikes and gunfights down in near Song Bay. And we kept dropping bombs on them, and they stood down there with impunity and just kept firing right back at us. We put 500-pound bombs on them, and they'd line up and open up on the next airplane that came in with their 30 calibers.
The low, slow-moving FACs were always at risk of being hit by what became known as Golden BB, a single lucky shot that could end a pilot's life in an instant. While the simple Bird Dog could survive considerable battle damage, its thin skin offered no protection for the pilot inside. A basic flak vest was the only real defense they had, and every FAC quickly learned the best way to use it.
So, if you were on the ground and a forward, and I was controlling, I'd wear the flak vest, but in the airplane, you didn't wear it, you sat on it. Because if you're going to get hit, it was going to come up through the floor or anything like that. There was no armor plate or anything in the O-1s. It's just very thin aluminum. There's nothing in the seat. So we used to put it under the cushion, and we used to sit on our flak vest to get the biggest size possible, believe me.
FACs often operated in pairs to discourage enemy fire and to ensure quick recovery if one was shot down. Many developed a weaving flight pattern where neither their heading nor altitude stayed stable long enough for enemy gunners to get a clear shot. However, the limited capabilities of the Bird Dogs and even the more powerful Skymasters were no match for the increasingly well-armed and capable communist forces emerging throughout the region. Hundreds of FACs were shot down, some more than once, and at least 219 were lost in action. In 1968, FAC operations in Southeast Asia took a huge step forward with the introduction of the North American OV-10 Bronco. The Bronco was the first aircraft specifically designed for FAC missions. Its two powerful engines allowed pilots to fly at significantly higher speeds and altitudes, while its tandem seating provided exceptional visibility. Equipped with advanced instruments, the Bronco allowed crews to operate at night and in poor weather. It also featured 5 powerful radios that enabled communication with almost anyone and could carry up to 28 marking rockets, greatly extending the time it could stay in the air before needing to rearm. The most significant improvement was the addition of armor plating and ejection seats, which greatly increased an FAC's chances at survival. The arrival of the Bronco provided a major boost to FAC operations in-country, but its enhanced capabilities had an even greater effect outside of Vietnam, in a different, more intense battle that had been raging for years. The battle was to close the infamous Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail became a vital supply route for communist forces operating in South Vietnam. In reality, the trail was a vast network of old footpaths that stretched around 1,700 miles from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia into the south. As the war intensified, North Vietnamese forces transformed the trail into a sophisticated road network capable of handling large truck convoys. The network evolved far beyond expectations. By 1967, communist convoys were delivering 60 tons of food, weapons, and ammunition daily to hundreds of units spread across the countryside. In the spring of 1965, the U.S. launched an enormous interdiction campaign aimed at cutting off the flow of men and supplies into South Vietnam. By early 1966, over 100 strike sorties were flown daily against the Ho Chi Minh Trail. At first, reconnaissance and strike coordination for the campaign were carried out by FACs, Flying 01s and 02s, from Air Force squadrons in South Vietnam, as well as from a newly formed squadron stationed at Nakhon Phantom Air Base in Thailand. However, the rugged terrain and increasing anti-aircraft fire along the trail began to significantly hinder FAC operations. The long-awaited arrival of the more capable Bronco gave a major boost to both the effectiveness and morale of FACs involved in the dangerous campaign.
We would go out every day with photographs that we would try to use to find the trucks. We had sensors that we had placed all over the trail called Igloo White, and the sensors would relay information back telling us that a certain sensor string in a certain location to hear 5 or 6 trucks passing by, and then we would try to find those trucks. And then a lot of times we would just visually find the trucks just through looking through binoculars, looking at the ground. And we used to call it busting trucks. We're going out to bust trucks.
The North Vietnamese Army became highly skilled at concealing weapons, supply caches, and truck depots. As in South Vietnam, the enemy's camouflage tactics forced FACs to focus on finding key indicators instead of directly spotting targets.
The North Vietnamese were very good, excellent at camouflaging things. But the thing that they never covered was their tracks. And we could tell from the air if tracks were new or old just by the way that they degraded the ground or the grass or something. And I became very adept at being able to follow a series of tracks into an area that was then perfectly camouflaged, and I would attack that area and blow off the cover, and sure enough, there would be something of value down there.
Despite these challenges, FACs were able to uncover and direct strikes against thousands of high-value targets. However, this fragmented approach seemed to have little effect on the massive flow of men and supplies moving south. As a result, many pilots began to develop new interdiction tactics on the fly, desperately trying to salvage the failing campaign.
There was the road itself. We would try to literally break the road. We would bomb it, crater it, and everything so that it was not passable, and the enemy would come back in very quickly and repair the road. And I mean, it was not unusual when we would go in on an airstrike and blow huge holes in the road. Literally, as the dust was clearing, the enemy troops would be out there with shovels filling in the holes again. There was just no way you could stop them.
To hinder repairs, FACs often aimed to create choke points in areas that were heavily trafficked but couldn't be easily bypassed.
We would take a specific place that was hard to repair, and we would just constantly bomb it. And same thing, they would be back in opening it very quickly. So we would target their road repair equipment. We would go after bulldozers. We would go after truck graders, stuff like that we would see down there.
Over time, many pilots came to the conclusion that the flood of men and supplies continued unabated.
They would float supplies down the rivers. So we would try to observe the rivers and watch for supplies moving that way. And then later in the war, they'd even built pipelines down through there to pipe fuel and stuff like that. And we would try to find the pipelines and bust those. And it was just a constant ongoing battle.
As the campaign to close the trail expanded and intensified, North Vietnamese efforts to defend it also grew. More anti-aircraft weapons, firing faster and with larger calibers, began lining major infiltration routes and choke points. Forward air controllers found themselves at the greatest risk of being struck by the intense fire, yet they still felt a profound responsibility for the fighters they guided. Before each strike, the FAC ensured the crews were aware of the nearest divert base and understood what to do if a crisis arose in the target area.
We would brief the fighters, hey, if you're hit, go here, try to bail out here. And I would try to show them where that was. I would say, if you need to bail out immediately, go west of the river or go to the high ground to the north, because they may not have much time. If an airplane is damaged, it's on fire, they only have seconds to eject.
The mere presence of a forward air controller provided strike crews with a significant sense of security. Every pilot knew that if one of their men went down, the FAC would do everything in his power to get him out alive. In 1971, a modified version of the Bronco promised to enhance both the safety and effectiveness of FAC missions. 15 aircraft were modified to carry an internally mounted night sensor, a precision navigation system called LORAN, and a laser target designator. The system, known as Pave-Nail, revolutionized FAC operations. For years, the North Vietnamese had primarily operated on the Ho Chi Minh Trail at night, using darkness as cover to allow large convoys to move with near impunity. The Pave-Nail system enabled crews not only to detect moving targets at night, but also to accurately target them for destruction with a new generation of laser-guided munitions.
This was the beginning, really, of a revolution in aerial warfare, if you will, because we began to use precision-guided weapons. And we found, though, that through the use of the laser-guided bombs, we could literally tuck bombs into caves, because what we would do is we would laze the target with our laser guidance, say about 50 meters short of the target, and the bomb would fall and guide on that position. And we knew about how long it would take for the bomb to fall from the airplane down to the ground. So just a few seconds before impact, we would then move the crosshairs on the laser system up to the mouth of the cave or just above it. And the bomb, of course, would try to follow the guidance and it would literally tuck and go into the mouth of the cave.
The addition of the OV-10 and the Pave-Nail system marked the pinnacle of FAC capabilities in Southeast Asia. Yet a small group of elite combat pilots continued to fly the simple old bird dogs in a top-secret campaign for much of the war. They operated under the call sign Raven. Their mission was to assist indigenous forces in a massive CIA-backed operation aimed at preventing the North Vietnamese army from invading Laos. The presence of American military personnel in what was called the Other Theater was officially denied by 3 consecutive White House and Pentagon administrations.
It was a clandestine program at the time because we were still trying to observe the, quote, neutrality of Laos as dictated under the Geneva Accords in 1962. So when we flew in civilian clothes, if you will, blue jeans and this type of stuff. And we were supposed to maintain some kind of a coverage that we were, in fact, up there working for the forestry agency or something like that. In fact, though, we were assigned to the embassy in Vientiane, and we worked directly with the various commanders throughout Laos.
Only the most skilled and daring FACs were chosen to join the Ravens' secretive campaign. The pilots mostly worked alone, executing every type of FAC mission imaginable from a network of rugged, remote airstrips scattered across Laos.
Up there, we could end up doing anything literally on a moment's notice. One mission, we would be working troops in contact, close air support with them. Another mission, we'd be out long range, we'd be busting trucks, doing regular interdiction, or going up and supporting an outpost that had been surrounded by bad guys. Occasionally, we'd be up talking to long-range ground teams that were out watching the trails, doing stuff like that. So you never knew what you were going to be doing day to day. Some days we'd just be out looking for targets. There's not much going on. And in other days, we'd be in the thick of a huge battle.
American airmen had to navigate increasingly complex and sometimes bewildering rules of engagement as the Southeast Asia conflict unfolded. The Ravens were also expected to follow specific air combat rules in Laos. However, in practice, they operated with near total autonomy.
When I was up as a Raven, we were the rules of engagement. I remember one day in particular, there was a new guy up working northeast of me, and he tried to put in an airstrike, and he obviously did not know what he was doing or where he was, and he was not following the proper procedures. So I just came up on the radio and I said, "This is Raven 2-5. This is my sandbox. You will not drop. Acknowledge." And they didn't drop because it wasn't clear where they were, what they were bombing, or what they were doing. And so there was always that risk of killing friendlies or in some cases just indigenous people that were friendly to us that we just wanted to try to leave alone.
Few records were kept of the Ravens' covert operations, but it is known that they faced one of the highest casualty rates of the entire conflict. Some speculate that nearly half of the pilots never returned home. The close relationships the pilots formed with Laotian ground forces exacerbated the challenges they faced. The Ravens often lived and worked alongside these men, willing to take extreme risks to assist them.
I knew these people. I knew who they were, and some of them, after Laos fell to the communists, made it to the United States, and we had formed some friendships based on all of that. But it became very personal sometimes, working with these guys. And a lot of times, if the weather was bad and the fighters couldn't get in to work with us, I'd take off, and instead of carrying smoke rockets on my O-1, I'd carry the high explosive rounds. I'd take 8 high explosive rounds, and I would go out and I would be my own fighter aircraft.
Close air support was always the primary mission for every FAC serving in Southeast Asia, whether in Laos, against the Ho Chi Minh Trail, or in South Vietnam. For many, these missions became deeply personal, rewarding, and potentially heartbreaking, especially when they had built strong connections with those they were trying to help. John Flanagan, more than anyone, understood this. He worked closely with the same small reconnaissance patrols from Project Delta, day in and day out. One such day, December 2nd, 1966, would remain etched in his memory. 2 days earlier, a 6-man team from the elite Special Forces unit had been mistakenly dropped into Laos. The patrol soon encountered North Vietnamese forces, with 3 of the men wounded, 1 severely. Flanagan was called in to help locate them and coordinate a desperate recovery operation. The weather was worsening, and no fighter support was available. To make matters even more dire, the helicopters were running dangerously low on fuel. A critical life-or-death decision had to be made.
I had to expedite things, and I probably made a tactical mistake, and I asked the team to throw smoke. So, because we needed to get the helicopters in there fast, and they dropped the smoke, and I had gone over the team before that. No ground fire, absolutely no ground fire. I looked right down at them. I was at about 50 feet. Saw their face, they kind of waved, and nobody shot at them. Absolutely no one. It was just, I looked around, I said, oh, okay. I don't see anybody, and then they brought the rescue, the pickup helicopter in, and the North Vietnamese, they waited, well-disciplined troops. They waited until the helicopter just got into the hover, and they opened up. And it was an ambush. They had sucked the helicopter in an ambush, and they started transmitting on the radio, we're taking fire, we're taking fire. I could hear the slugs from the AK-47s. I could hear them hitting the airplane, the helicopter. You could hear them going through the metal. And then you hear the door gunners with their M60 machine guns firing back, hammering back. And I got on the radio, I said, get out of there, get out of there. And the helicopter started to lift off, climbed them at 300 feet, and then just nosed over and plunged into the jungle. A big fireball. There was 4 Americans, the helicopter crew, plus the Special Forces medic that was on board, that just perished right there. In the meantime, the team on the ground, they said, FAC, please help us, we're hurt bad. So I went in there, making like I was going to have an airstrike, firing rockets, throwing stuff out the window to try and distract the North Vietnamese to think that there was an airstrike coming because they'd run and hide. I started firing the rockets in there, and I couldn't even get my rockets to go off because I was so close that the rockets didn't go far enough to arm. So I had nothing but a high-speed spear. So I withdrew to try and see, what could I do? I called Hillsborough, which was the Air Force Command C-130 that was over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They were up around 18,000 feet. And I said, Hillsborough, I need some A-1s fast. I got people that are dying, and we're going to lose them. And they said, sorry, we don't have anything. There's nothing flying. We just can't get them in. And so that's the tragedy. I mean, I knew it was over then. The tears just rolled out my face. And I said, God, I don't know. So I flew back over to where the team had been. I looked down, and nobody shot at us. I was surprised. But there's no equipment there. There was just trampled grass, no bodies, nothing.
Forward air controllers played a critical and often understated role throughout the Vietnam War. The massive, multifaceted American campaign would have been much more difficult, if not impossible, without their brave and unique form of support. Several Medal of Honor recipients in Vietnam were FACs, underscoring the extraordinary skill and courage required to carry out their missions.
The FACs were a step in the appropriate direction in trying to bring air power to bear where it could be effective. But still, in a jungle environment where it's easy to mask your moves and easy to hide, it's very difficult, even with a slow-moving aircraft like an O-1 or an O-2 or an OV-10, to accurately identify, pinpoint, and bring air power to bear on ground target.
Although FACs have never enjoyed the same recognition as the pilots of fast, powerful fighter bombers, their efforts are dignified by the incredible risks they faced daily. Their courage is remembered and respected by thousands of pilots and infantrymen who may never have made it home without their unwavering support.
I just spared this flight here that's getting ready to make the angle to take off. We've got over 50 airplanes involved in this strike force, and it was going to be a big raid up near the Hanoi area, but the weather's bad. Now they're going to various other areas. A spares job, for every 4 airplanes we launch one spare up the end of the runway. In case one of the airplanes that we're having trouble with, they can fill in any 4 position, any one of the 4 positions. He's usually a leader, so in case the leader aboard, he can fill in that spot. You see this flight taking off now, and the airplane standing by is the spare. He'll be coming back up like me probably pretty soon. Like before, that's why we have a spare out there, because if we didn't, we'd never get another airplane up in time.
This is an F-105G, the wild weasel variant of the Thunderchief. The last mutation of a plane that when first produced was the biggest single-engine, single-seat fighter aircraft ever built. The F-105 was an awesomely powerful weapon, and in the skies of Vietnam, it was to become known as the one-man Air Force. The designer of the F-105 was Alexander Catvelli, chief designer at Republic and no stranger to the concept of big fighter aircraft. For he had been the designer of the World War II P-47 Thunderbolt, the biggest single-engine fighter of its day, which has been produced in large numbers and had proved itself a sturdy workhorse not only in its intended role as an air superiority or escort fighter, but as a fighter bomber in the tactical support mission. Work on Advanced Project 63, the series of design studies that led to the 105, commenced in 1951, at the height of the Korean War. Essentially as a privately funded update of Republic's F-84. The 84 had been developed as a jet Thunderbolt for the escort and tactical fighter bomber roles. In Korea, it proved not up to the escort role in competition with the MiG-15, but it performed well in the ground attack. The 84's straight wings were part of a very conventional overall design. And indeed, the plane's latter manifestations exhibited swept wings more appropriate to the potential speed of the jet. But with the experience of Korea to guide them and the rapid pace of technological development to compel them, the design team soon realized that they were setting out to design a completely new plane. As the team at Republic was setting out on their project, the counterparts of North American Company had just received U.S. Air Force support for the F-100 Super Sabre, first of the series of planes known as the Sentry Fighters that were to cover the multiple fighter roles that perceived as the Air Force moved to supersonic capability. Starting life as a reworking of the successful F-86 Sabre, the F-100 was originally described as an air superiority fighter, but its latter variations added fighter bombing capabilities. With a maximum speed of 860 miles an hour, the Hun was USA's first supersonic fighter, and, particularly in tactical support role, was to prove valuable in Vietnam. The next plane was the McDonnell F-101 Voodoo, designed as a penetration fighter and escort fighter. The rapidity of development in aviation can be judged by the fact that, though only ordered 12 months later than the F-100, the 101 had a top speed of 1,100 miles an hour. Again, the plane developed tactical capability in its later models and it was used extensively in Vietnam, most notably in photo reconnaissance. Third of the Sentry fighters was the F-102 Delta Dagger from General Dynamics, an all-weather interceptor commenced in 1950. Capable of 820 miles an hour, it proved only a moderate success, but naturally was to develop to become the F-106, which had a top speed of 1,500 miles an hour. The Lockheed Starfighter, the F-104, ordered in March 1953, sought flight performance at all costs as an air superiority fighter. Basically a manned missile, the 1,400 mile per hour 104 had a checkered career, but has demonstrated amazing longevity as a tactical strike and reconnaissance aircraft. At Republic, Clark Belly's team working on Advanced Project 63. After a program that ran to 108 configurations had emerged with a design for a single-engine, single-seat tactical fighter bomber with the capacity to carry nuclear weapons in an internal bomb bay. This plane, the 105A, was given Air Force approval in September 1952, originally with the intention of mass production, but in the end only 2 were built. The 105, rounding out the Sentry fighters, was the first purpose-designed tactical strike aircraft ordered for the United States Air Force. The perception of need for such a plane derived from a combination of Korean battlefield experience, geopolitics, and the interest-service competition between the strategic and tactical air commands of the USAF. For TAC, the 105, in addition to opening up parameters of their new conventional role, brought with it the capability to carry nuclear weapons over a long range, with a corresponding rise in their prestige to rival that of the Strategic Command. The Tactical Air Command support of the 105 was to prove vital to the project as the plane went through its difficult early years. Virtually all the technology and engineering of aircraft were being revolutionized at once, in response to the myriad physical changes inherent in the transition of the age of supersonic flight, and the F-105 was to have plenty of developmental problems in the years ahead. But what made the huge fighter so special was its large internal capacity. The atom bombs, more reminiscent of drums than weapons, gave it a potency far beyond any competitor. For the F-105A, significant breakthroughs in understanding the effects of transonic drag, together with some inherent deficiencies, had already seen the design superseded. It first flew for the 3 years after the USAF go-ahead, and then by then its internal systems had changed beyond recognition. Also by then, manufacture of its replacement was underway. The third F-105 was the first of the B model. We see it here on the 26th of May 1956 as it taxis to its takeoff point for its first flight. This was the first 105 to have a power plant big enough to match its size, and major external changes had also been incorporated, chief among which was the area ruling, which had rescued the F-102 from its drag and turbulence problems. This had replaced the straight lines on the A model with a slim hip over the wing. A massive 4-pedaled air brake now dominated the previously clean lines of the engine exhaust, and there had also been changes made to the air intakes, giving the Thunderchief its characteristic nostrils. A larger tail area had increased stability. These and other changes have resulted in a plane with the capacity to double the speed of sound. Perhaps symbolically, this first flight was to be beset by almost fatal problems. It was intended that the flight be short, little more than a quick circuit. But when it came time to lower the wheels, there was no response from the nose wheel. Raising and lowering the wheels had no effect. The nose wheel would not budge. Rather than abandon the plane, it was decided to attempt a wheels-up landing, and so the test pilot set the machine down on a long, dangerous slide across the salt. Eventually, the plane came to a halt, and emergency crews converged on the site in the slowly clearing dust. The crash was more than an intense embarrassment for a project that was already being scrutinized as excessively expensive and troubled by technical problems. However, it was still possible to argue that the problems were being solved in ways that consistently improved the overall capability of the plane, and that even as simply as a test program, the 105 was revolutionizing the understanding not only of the science of aviation, but the potentiality of a tactical aircraft. The cause of the crash was soon identified in the new air intake controls, which at the high thrust settings were jamming the wheel in a position, a fairly simple thing to correct. One other thing that the crash demonstrated was something that those who flew the Thunderchief in action came to know and approve of its toughness. The plane was lifted, the undercarriage was lowered, and the prototype was towed away to be mended and rebuilt. Rebuilt, the plane rejoined the test program. As work progressed on tying together all the systems and ironing out all the bugs in the components, the engineers were dealing with concepts and forces they could only barely control, and overcoming the snags as they appeared. It's difficult to think of any other way that these problems, theoretical and practical, could have kept up with the intense scramble of technical development. In being the first plane capable of both air-to-air fighting and air-to-ground semi-automatic weapons delivery, the plane relied on avionics packages far in advance of anything previously attempted. Among these advanced facilities were radar models for air search, contour mapping, terrain following, and automatic tracking of air and ground targets even in blind conditions. Throughout its life, the 105 was to almost constantly receive new and updated facilities. But even from the first, this was a plane that was far ahead of its time. The rebuilt plane was allocated to conduct the spin testing program, a spin recovery parachute which installed on the tail of the plane. This required removing a panel to afford room for the chute and removing the air brake so that, if needed, the chute would be unimpeded. Trials on the chute demonstrated that it worked satisfactorily. The aim of spin testing is to ensure that the plane can be recovered from a spin to normal flight. That, once control has been lost, it can be regained. Of course, the first thing to do in such a test is to lose control of the aircraft deliberately. Then, the test pilot sits there while his plane plummets through the air for a specified duration, and then he attempts recovery. This is not for the faint-hearted. The emergency spin recovery parachute was not needed, as the planes proved to have a natural tendency to level out after each revolution, and the pilots were able to resume control fairly easily. However, the airframe still had to be tested, and so the trials went on. "47 times the pilots let go and watched the horizon slide away slickingly as the plane commenced its fall. If you look carefully here, you'll see a pillar of flame leap from the tail of the plane as the engine stalls. Though the flight test proceeded well, the technical problems persisted, with the engine and the avionics still unreliable. The uncertainty of performance was matched by a wider uncertainty about the future of the plane. The original expectation of large production had been amended to 37, then cancelled altogether in December 1953. A reinstated order in February 1954 was for 15 aircraft, but by September this had already come back to 3. In October, it was back to 6. Parallel for the state of flux, the operational requirements for the new fighter had already been repeatedly amended before being first published in December 1954, and, by April 1955, had been changed 3 more times. The men conducting the test series went on with their work, while uncertainty continued to shroud the future of the project. The 105's already considerable range had been augmented by the addition of external fuel tanks, and these two had to be tested to establish the effect they had on the plane, as well as to test the tanks themselves. Throughout 1957, the testing went on, with the test aircraft logging many hours over the desert as the plane was slowly sorted out through multiple modifications. The pre-service evaluations, due for completion in November 1959, were to eventually go on until March 1961. Of the specifications added in 1954 was that the F-105 should be capable of in-flight refueling, another recent innovation already being widely used. With an airplane like the F-105, this was a tricky proposition. For the fighter pilot to slow down to the same speed as the tanker left him with insufficient airflow over the wings to maintain lift. The top speed of the tanker and lowest speed of the F-105 were very close, and, as you see, the fighter becomes very hard to maneuver, especially in the turbulence of the larger plane, and often stalls entirely. Attempts to alleviate the problem by handing jets to the tankers, as here to a B-29, didn't help all that much. All supersonic fighters had trouble until jet tankers raised the speed of refueling to safer levels. The test confirmed the difficulty for the pilot of the fighter, and although successful couplings were made, the system remained largely impractical. Not due to any failure of the F-105, but because of the inadequacies of the tankers. Having the drogue trail from the wingtip rather than from the tail of a plane removed the operation from the worst of the larger plane's turbulence, and facilitated matters somewhat, but the tendency to stall still remained. The equipment in use, the long drogue hose, did not make things any easier with the requirement for the pilot of the fighter to maneuver onto the drogue. Not until this necessity was replaced by a system where he simply holds position in relation to the tanker and the operator in the tanker directs the connection was refueling truly a practical affair. The F-105 was equipped with two types of refueling connectors, and these were to see a lot of use in the Thunderchief's career. Back at the end of 1954, our public must have been wondering about the fate of the 105, and their anxiety can have only been slightly alleviated by the bittersweet news that they received in February 1955. The order was lifted back to 5th Keen, with the allowance for the rest of the original 34 only if funds were available in the coming fiscal year. To add to this ambiguous news was the unsettling proviso that there'd be a fly-off against the North American company's F-107, an updated, high-powered, and re-eclipsed Super Sabre variant. Had the 107 been compared to almost any other plane at the time, it may have outperformed it. However, the 105 was a rather special opponent, and the performance of the controversial big plane was beginning to quell the doubts about its worth. The revisions of the Thunderchief specifications had continued in a stream of expansions of its system's capability. Constant electronic elevations proceeded throughout the plane's development and its operational lifetime, continuing to maintain the F-105 at the forefront of performance. The plethora of design changes meant that the first 15 F-105s produced represented 5 distinct subtypes. Eventually, there would have been 19. During the test program, of course, the revisions of the plane meant that the trials were regularly extended. The normal flight testing programs were consistently completed with little trouble, as the airframe behaved very well and had admirable flight characteristics. However, the electronics of the newly conceived and developing systems caused continuing delays as their performance was lifted to their supposed specifications. With the benefit of hindsight, we can appreciate what a fine aircraft was evolving in the process. But at the time, eyebrows were being raised as there was considerable skepticism about the plane. On the 28th of May 1958, 3 years later than originally expected, the USAF took delivery of its first operational 105. Fittingly, it was the only one of its subtype. The Air Force pilots had been disappointed to hear that their new mount was in fact a rather large bomber, and had christened the plane in advance rather disparagingly as the lead sled, Thunder Thud, or Plain Thud. Now, they got their hands on it for the first time and immediately changed their minds, and Thud in particular came to mean F-105. But no longer in any derogatory sense. The big plan was to be universally popular with those who flew them. Not only did it handle and perform as a fighter, but it packed a combination of punches that was truly awesome. Fully laden, a 105 could carry 14,000 pounds of a very wide range of external stores, including all normal bombs, rockets or rocket pods, cannon pods, electronic countermeasures, packed air-to-surface missiles, and sidewinder air-to-air missiles. But almost as the reason for its existence, the Thunderchief also had a bomb bay. To minimize supersonic drag, the bomb bay doors retracted neatly into the plane. To control the ejection of the bomb, both for accuracy's sake and to ensure the bomb was clear of the aircraft, it was pushed down with a pneumatic rack. The rack was strong enough to be used as a jack to load the bay if there was no bomb trolley available in wartime operations. However, the Thuds carried very few bombs internally. Most of the time, the bomb bay was occupied by a further reserve of fuel on the outer wing. There was a provision for 2 stores pylons to be fitted. These could be used to carry weaponry and fuel in any desired combination, or removed to allow the attachment of specialized delivery racks for other armaments, like this installation for the Sidewinder. The standard build and armament for all Thunderchief variants was a General Electric M61 20mm multi-barrel gun. This gun fired at 6,000 rounds per minute and could fire off the entire 1,029 shells it carried in less than 11 seconds. Air Force deliveries continue with the 335th Tactical Air Squadron, becoming the first fully equipped with the new fighter and celebrating by setting a world speed record. In 1961, the first overseas deployments were made to bases in Germany. Far away from Europe, the summer of 1964, so the Thud goes into action for the first time. Soon, they were sporting new camouflage as they were deployed in larger numbers to bases in Thailand and South Vietnam. From those bases, they launched the campaigns that were to write their name into history. For the F-105, Vietnam was the right place at the right time. Even during their service life, up to that time there had been continued problems with reliability, and as recently as 1962, they had all been grounded. Though those problems had been ironed out, the plague of minor defects and a series of accidents had continued almost up to their first Vietnamese missions. But the Thuds in Vietnam were to earn a completely different reputation as reliable and duro airplanes. They also earned a fearsome reputation as weapons. The importance of the Thunderchief in Vietnam can be simply indicated during the first 5 years of their involvement there. They flew an amazing 75% of all USAF attack missions. If the skies of Vietnam were full of bombs, it was because the Thuds put them there. From March 1965, increasing numbers of airstrikes were made on North Vietnam, predominantly directed at communications targets. The raids relied almost entirely on the F-105s. The planes would heave themselves into the air with their loads of bombs and head for a rendezvous with a tanker near the North Vietnam border. But with the level of external stores they were carrying, and the way that increasingly they had to fly flat out all the way across Vietnam rather than cruising to and from the target, the range had been cut considerably, and even with full tanks, the journeys didn't leave much to spare. Then, they flew into hostile airspace. At the beginning of the war, the North Vietnamese had only limited air defenses, and the earliest raids were relatively quiet. Soon, however, supplies on anti-aircraft artillery, surface-to-air missiles, and MiG fighters began to multiply. And the raids were flown into the teeth of the most intensive air defense systems ever tested in warfare at that time. Production of the 105s had been completed in December 1964. Only 78 of the B model had ever been built. The remaining 610 had been F-105Ds. The D had acquired an extended nose, accommodating all-weather navigation systems, and thus was externally dissimilar to the B. the other 143 with a twin-seat F model. It had always been expected that there would be a twin-seat version of the plane, but 2 earlier twin-seat proposals had been dropped. The Fs were to provide the stock for the later development of the last 105, the G, the Wild Weasel. The workhorse of the bombing raids was the D. The single-seaters are bounded on the bases where the work of war went on 24 hours a day. At the end of each mission, the returning pilot would confer with his crew chief about the performance of the plane and handed it over to him for service. The service record of the F-105s in Vietnam was excellent. On any given day, over 90% of the funds were ready for work. This figure was higher than the overall average within the USAF. And considering the complexity, workload, and relative scarcity of the big planes, it's all the more outstanding to keep them in the air. Facilities for total maintenance of the planes were built at the bases they flew their missions from, and specialist teams were constantly available to fly in to handle specific problems. Teams of ground crew at the bases carried out the normal turnaround routines, like refueling, filling the water tank in the tail for the afterburner, rearming the plane, and other servicing required between missions quickly and efficiently. The body of the plane was a patchwork of hatches, allowing access to the equipment inside. The big fuselage had very little spare room inside it, but the layout was good enough to ensure that servicing was relatively straightforward. The bases were a far cry from the mud and improvisation of the Second World War. A Thunderchief parked on Tackley's acres of hearthstand could be serviced with relative ease. The wing point combinations for the next missions were selected and affected, and the plane armed in the smooth and practice routine. A large part of the bombs that were dropped on Vietnam were iron bombs of the Second World War. Vintage, sadly, they were a part of a design philosophy and era that should have been long gone. However, modern smart bombs were not to really arrive in Vietnam until the F-111s used them in the last phases of the conflict. So the F-105 missions were often flown to deliver hardware that was uncontrolled in flight, often unstable in trajectory and sometimes unreliable in effect. But with these bombs, the Thuds hammered the North and in most instances destroyed their allocated targets right through the night. The bases were a hive of activity. At the work of repairing, servicing, and arming the planes went on. Another factor that makes the 90% availability of the Thuds even more impressive was their toughness. They kept coming back from missions with major battle damage to repair. Thuds sustained strikes from SAMs as well as AAAs and mid-cannons and still survived. This one has actually survived a hit from a Sidewinder. Each morning, the one man's air forces waited ready. In March 1965, the USAF flew the first of the Rolling Thunder series of strikes. The inclusion of the reference to Thunder is fitting, as throughout its 3 years, Rolling Thunder was to be the almost exclusive province of the Thunderchief. The fuller extension of the air war into the North had 3 purposes. First, to reduce the infiltration of the South. Second, to give pause to the communist leadership in Hanoi. And thirdly, to bolster the morale of the Southern leadership and the people of South Vietnam. As the name implies, the strikes rolled forward into the north, targets being progressively further and further over the border, and the thunder was real. The damage to the North's bridges and railways and roads extracted a great cost on the communists and hampered their war effort considerably. However, though at times apparently shaken, the Hanoi leadership did not break. The Thuds flew in on their deadly missions, and the Vietnamese tried with everything the Russians and Chinese could give them to knock them from the sky. North Vietnam was not an ideal target for a sustained bombing campaign. There was little industrial infrastructure to damage and almost no war production. The country had an agrarian society, predominantly rural and dispersed. The few major targets in the terms of docks and storage were within the exclusion zones around Hanoi and Haiphong, the 2 major cities. For political reasons, these areas were not bombed for most of the war, as the US consistently tried to negotiate an end to the fighting. The Thud pilots learned their own ways of coping with the streams of sands that rose of them, splitting and diving to confuse and evade the missiles. In tangles with the MiGs, the 105s came off well. They had such reverse of power that if a MiG managed to get in position to fire, they could in most cases simply accelerate away from them further. The Thuds were capable of turning the tables on their attackers and really mixing it up. 28 MiG-17s were down by 105s. The bombs continued to rain down on Vietnam. Supporting the bombing was an electronics and communications network of unprecedented technical sophistication. Operations controllers directed a huge fleet of varied craft in the air at enemy level, from artillery spotter planes to B-52s. They dispatched rescue operations for downed pilots and coordinated the activities of tankers, bombers, and fighters. Off the coast of North Vietnam prowled the Big Eye planes packed with sensitive radar and alert for the slightest activity from the mid squadrons. Any appearance of the MiGs was monitored and the information relayed to the fighters in the area. The constant observation, coupled with the air superiority of the Phantoms and Thunderchiefs, served to ensure that for the large periods of the war, the Communist Air Force stayed on the ground, pragmatically accepting that they could not compete. The controllers and their equipment directing the airstrikes were themselves part of a chain of command that stretched back from the Vietnam through the Pacific headquarters in Hawaii all the way to Washington, where the targets were identified and authorized. At the very end of the chain were the Thuds, sending off daily with their loads. Thousands and thousands of sorties succeeded one another, with the F-105s carrying most of the load. Whether or not one questions the strategic effect of the program, it is impossible to not acknowledge the burden that the Thunderchiefs carried and the effectiveness with which they pursued their assignments. In June 1967, the first of the Thuds to do so reached the halfway point in their theoretical 4,000-hour fatigue lifetime, to be followed soon by others. The most critical fatigue concern was the strains upon the engines. The missions that the Thuds were flying were unlike anything originally envisaged. They were regularly returning at full power with afterburner for extended periods of time. The stress on the power plants was enormous. The hot sections of the huge J-75 engine were particularly vulnerable to this type of treatment. Already, there had been some shortages of spares. As a safeguard, their normal engine life between changes was reduced from 200 to 125 hours. And teams of mechanics worked on overhauling the engines, testing them and reinstalling them on the planes. By August 1968, the 388th Squadron was flying Thunderchiefs with 3,000 hours under its belt. Having gone out on 500 missions, received flag damage on several occasions, and have been involved in mid-air collision earlier in the year. By October, 3 more had passed the mark. They were growing old fast. An earlier suggestion to reopen the lines and build more F-105s had been considered, then dropped. There was a replacement for much of the work already available in the Phantom, and construction was proceeding apace on their successor, a design that had been much influenced by the story of the Thud and which had reflected many of the lessons learned in its combat life, the F-111. For the time being, the Thuds were made indispensable, and they were constantly tended to maintain their status and prolong their life. The Thuds remained in Vietnam to the end. Not only the two-seater SAM suppressing wild weasels, but also the Ds and Fs with their bombs, tactical support, and electronic countermeasure systems. The Thuds were still workhorses right through to the devastating Linebreaker 1 and 2 operations that finally brought the North to a negotiation position that allowed the US to withdraw from the conflict. Their bombing had sustained the air war against North Vietnam. There was no other plane at the time that could have done the job. The bombing was fiercely pressed home, and the results devastating, particularly when they were directed against a specific industrial target, as here on this truck maintenance depot. The Ho Chi Minh Trail buzzed with activity during the bombing halts, with trucks bumper to bumper, illustrating 2 points: the wily resolve of the Vietnamese in pursuit of their aims, and the effectiveness of bombing. With Thuds about, the trucks were far more circumspect. The pilot's tour of duty was 100 missions, and the Thuds saw hundreds of pilots through their tour and home again. They were men who were undoubtedly universally glad to be out of the war, glad to have done their job and survived. However, many of them were still to miss their big machines and the sensation of howling through the air at a huge metal monster at twice the speed of sound. Captain John Piawani began growing his mustache when he first arrived in Vietnam in 1967. When he finished his 100th mission, the mustache was 12¼ inches long. On his 55th mission, his Thud was hit by artillery over the Paul Duma Bridge near Hanoi during a bombing run. His story is typical. Not only did he hit the bridge and bring down a span, but the damaged Thud brought him home to finish his tour. Some of the Wild Weasel and other specialist planes stayed with the USAF after Vietnam, but the 105s were progressively phased out and retired into the hands of the pilots of the Air Force Reserves. There were not too many of them about, and they faded rather quickly from use. The last reserve of an F-105 was on the 25th of May 1983, exactly 25 years after the accident on the first flight of the 105B. Many pilots sat in the seat of an F-105 and went through the startup process. Many owed their lives to them. Most of them consider their plane the best in the inventory. The big fighter grew from its problem childhood, and the parameters of what an aircraft could be asked to do grew with it. In an era of multiple transitions, it is an astounding achievement that so much was got right so well in one package. There were never that many of them, and their reputation is perhaps not widespread. Nevertheless, the plane was certainly outstanding.
The Vietnam War saw the U.S. Armed Forces attempt to overpower a determined North Vietnamese foe with superior training and weapons. As the years of conflict raged on, the Soviets supplied the North Vietnamese with more sophisticated aircraft and technology, in an attempt to thwart these American efforts. Commander J.R. Hot Dog Brown of the U.S. Navy faced this ever-changing threat head-on in the cockpit of his F-8 Crusader. He witnessed the evolution of the U.S. Navy's fighter tactics and training, and helped prepare the next wave of Navy pilots for the life-or-death situations they would encounter in Vietnam.
When I was getting my wings, I graduated #1 in my class that month, and I picked F4s because that was the hottest thing in the world at the time. And then I picked Demons, the F3, and all the Demons were old, but they were all transitioning over to the F4, so I figured, you know, either way I'm going to get F4s. And the only other fighter we had was the F8 Crusader, and I put that down because that was the third choice. You had to make 3 choices. And I wanted to be on the East Coast because when I was a sailor, I was on the East Coast, and I was pretty familiar with it. So I picked East Coast, East Coast, East Coast for all 3 of those slots. Well, my orders came, Crusaders, Miramar, California. I didn't get my coast. I didn't get my first choice, my second choice. I got my last choice. And I went to the skipper and I said, "Skipper, what's with this? I worked really, really hard to be #1. I should have got my first choice." And he said, "Son," he says, "you're too young to understand, but you did get your first choice." He says, this is the job everybody wants. They want single seat, supersonic, San Diego, California. You are going to the place for fighter pilots. And he was absolutely right. You taxi down the runway, and there was what we call the gun pits, but it was a square, long, rectangular building where you would put the airplane and you would sight in the guns. And it was right along the taxiway. And so as you came along there on the side of the gun butts building, it said Fightertown, USA. That's what it said, Fightertown, USA. And so, there you were, man, right there in San Diego, with Fightertown, USA. So I started flying Crusaders, and it was an outstanding experience. The training that you go through the buildup of air-to-air combat, ACM, air combat maneuvering. So when you're doing ACM training, you start out one-on-one, and you go through different maneuvers, and you have classroom work on them, and they show you what the airplane can do. And you have what you call a VN diagram, which is the speed and the energy that the airplane has when it's maneuvering. So when you pull back on the stick and start turning, you put G's on the airplane. The airplane is built to take 6.5 times the weight of one gravity force. So like your head weighs 40 pounds, so when you're at 6.5 G's, it weighs 240 pounds. So you don't want to turn your head like this because your head will go right down to the bottom of the cockpit. But they teach you how to maneuver against each other, and this is like type airplanes. So both airplanes that's in the training program have the same turning capability, the same deceleration, acceleration capabilities. So it's pretty, you got to be really, really good to get an advantage against the same airplane. And then you go through, I think there's, 15 or 16 flights like that. And pretty soon you're one-on-one with the instructor, and he's pulling everything he's got. Up until that point, he's setting you up to see what the airplane will do. Then you go into air-to-air gunnery, and you have a tow plane hauling a 20-foot banner that's 20 foot by 4 feet, and you fire live rounds at that. And you go into the pattern where you roll in on the target, and you come down and you press the target, and they tell you, it says, you want to get so close to that banner before you shoot that you think you're going to hit it with the airplane. And on more than one occasion, guys have hit the banner. I think you got target fixation, they call it. But you have to be inside of 500 feet with the guns because they just don't have the range and the accuracy outside that. And even though we trained ourselves to get into a guns attack, in reality, we had very few gun attacks where we actually shot somebody with a gun. All the kills up until towards the end of the war and after Top Gun, the Crusaders had almost all the MiG kills because the rules of engagement required you to visually identify the target before you could shoot at it. So in an F4, for instance, you had guys taking binoculars and you know, they would be vectored in on a target and they'd say it's a MiG, but before he could shoot a Sparrow, he had to visually identify it as a MiG, and for good reason. On one occasion, I was flying wing on the Skipper in 1965, and we rolled in and engaged some F-100s that were up in the north part of Vietnam. And without a visual confirmation, identification, we would have probably shot down 2 of our own. So that totally negated the beyond visual range capability of the F-4. The long-range radar and the long-range Sparrow, which had a head-on capability. So the rules of engagement negated the beyond visual range capability of the Phantom. The situation was, you know, when we first started in 63, 64, the fighters were doing fighter escort, you know, prevent, you know, attacks by other airplanes on our recon airplanes, reconnaissance airplanes. When we came back in 65, you know, the MiG threat was minimal. Nobody ever thought the MiGs would ever come up against us. They did, as you know, and as time went on from 65, 66, 67, 68, those years, they were up in force, the MiGs were. You know, there were probably 1 or 2 guys that were pretty good in air-to-air, but they didn't have the skills that we had. And so the MiGs weren't really a threat. They were more, to us in the Crusader, they were more of a treat. Boy, wouldn't it be nice for one of those guys to show up here, we'd get a kill. That was your attitude. The main threat to us as pilots was AAA, anti-aircraft artillery. And it went from 23 millimeter all the way up to 155s, you know, big, huge artillery shells, and which they would, and they were all visually controlled mainly, but they would barrage us, you know, and we'd be coming, if we came in at 20,000 feet, they'd set all the timers to go off at 20,000 feet. And they used balloons to figure out how high we were, you know, what our altitude was. And then you'd roll in, trying to hit the target with your nose down at the target, dropping bombs and shooting rockets and things and guns. They'd be shoot launch them all the time. And then they've got the SAM missiles, SA-2s, surface-to-air 2s built by the Russians. And so they started putting out these missile sites, and so we were in there trying to interdict. Every time we saw something set up like it was going to be a missile site, we'd come in and bomb it, you know, trying to bomb it back in the dirt. And of course, they're very resilient. You know, they'll just rearrange the dirt pile after you leave. We had to adapt. The Crusader was a slick fighter. We didn't have bomb racks on our airplanes. The F-8E, which was the last version of the Crusader, did have bomb racks. And so they were already able to carry anywhere from 4 to 6 bombs plus Zuni 5-inch Zuni rockets. My airplane, which was the D, had racks on the side of the airplane for sidewinders, but they manufactured Zuni pods, and for each sidewinder, which carries 4 sidewinders, 1 on each, 2 on each side, we could substitute a Zuni pod, which carried 2 5-inch rockets for those. So frequently we would go with 700 rounds of 20 millimeter and 4 Zunis and 2 sidelines. And so we had a dual role of target combat air patrol against MiGs. And then we also had flak suppression. We call our missions flak absorbers because we took more than we gave. But we would be the first ones to roll in with guns and Zunis to try to suppress the AAA sites. And we'd map those all out through photographic runs. We knew where they were, and we'd try to, obliterate them. And then the bombers would come in, the light attack with their bombs, and hit the main targets. In 66, 67, 68, when we were really bombing the north, I think there was a campaign called Rolling Thunder, where we were just flying lots and lots of sorties. So you fly lots of sorties, you make lots of presentations, you take a lot of risk. The Vietnamese saw multiple targets. They could fly or not fly, they don't care. You're flying over their property, their country. And so they took off when they wanted to, with as many as they wanted to. So if they thought you weren't paying attention, they would come in low. It was their country. They could fly down, Georgetown Pike. They've been down that road many times, and pop up and shoot you out of the sky and disappear into the trees again. And you never see them coming because they had the radar control. They had the visual eyes on the ground. They could see you coming. They had observation posts. They knew you were coming. They knew where you were going normally. And they would ambush you. And the Air Force would come in with big clouds of airplanes. The biggest cloud that we ended up with was 40 some odd airplanes. But nevertheless, they would key themselves to jump you, either coming in or blowing away. At the time we were most vulnerable. And so, they were flying a lot of MiG sorties. And as a result of our training, the Crusaders were doing pretty well in kill ratios. And I think we were pretty near 10 to 1 in 67, 68. The F-4s weren't doing good because they weren't trained in air-to-air combat. The F-4s were trained to exploit their weapon system, which was a long-range radar. They could pick up a target at 60 miles, they could track it, and they could shoot it without even seeing it, head on. A Sparrow missile would just launch, radar-controlled, would go down there and shoot the target. You didn't ever have to see him. Not true with a Sidewinder. You had to get behind the guy with a Sidewinder to get an infrared tone, an IR tone, before you could release it. And it had to be within a certain envelope. If you get to a situation where you have to maneuver, you're within visual sight of each other, then you're in a dogfight. And they were coming to a dogfight. We used to say, you're coming to the fight completely unprepared. And so the kill ratio with the F-4s was terrible. They were only allowed to shoot Sidewinders. They had no guns. In very rare occasions would they get a Sparrow shot, a radar missile shot, because they would be inside the range because they were in visual combat and they were at a disadvantage. I mean, even the Crusaders with their training and their maneuverability at low altitudes, below 20,000 feet, we were having our hands full trying to fight these guys. And of course, the F-4 guys didn't have that training. That wasn't part of their syllabus. And so Frank Ault was disturbed by this, and he was commissioned by the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Moore, to study this. And he came out with a report in the end of '68, which said we need to change the way we train. Because this is the war we're fighting, not the war we designed for, but the war we're fighting, and we need to change the way we train each other. We started between the F-8 training squadron, the Crusaders training squadron, 124, and 121, the F-4 squadron, both of which were Naval Air Station Miramar, California, in San Diego, the operations department guys got together and said, hey, we need to, you know, Captain Ault, the Ault report says we got to, you know, revise our training schedules here and what we do. And so they came to us and said, you know, we need to understand what we need to do to be able to do air-to-air combat. And so we got together a team, and we developed a course, which became the first fighter weapons course, and it was in VF 121 because we already had ours. And then it became more evident we had to change the tactics as time went on because the enemy would change their tactics, and we'd adapt those. And there was still more collaboration in '69. And then we stood up Fighter Weapons School and separated that out as a separate entity on its own 2 feet. We have DACM, which was dissimilar air combat maneuvering, which was you bring in something different than the airplane you were flying. If you're flying an F4, you'd fly against an F8, or an F4 against an A4, or in the case of Top Gun, they had the F5s. And so we said, hey, we need dissimilar too, so we started flying our guys against the F5s, and they set up a curriculum totally focused on air combat maneuver and weaponry, air-to-air combat. And they had instructors assigned from the different fighter squadrons, and usually the top guy in your squadrons was handpicked to be an instructor in Top Gun. It wasn't called Top Gun there, it was a fighter weapons school. It wasn't until, I don't know, probably in the early 70s that it was nicknamed Top Gun. They had a quota system in the early 70s where they would say you could nominate an air crew, a pilot, and a Navy flight officer, a backseater, radar operator, for a class. And they would have a limited number of pilots, air crew in each class, and you go through this curriculum. And each squadron, you know, you obviously couldn't do it when you were deployed on the ship, but when you come back, you'd apply for a slot, and they'd assign you a slot to go through the school. Once the guy goes through the school, he gets a certificate of achievement, and then he goes back to the squadron and he becomes the training officer, the weapons training officer in the squadron. And so you got a guy who's you know, as we call it, the Top Gun trained expert is now in your squadron, and he takes on the responsibility of passing on all the Top Gun capability to his pilots and aircrew through this training program. When I was in 124, I was sent there as a senior LSO, landing signal officer, because they had just sent the F-8J to the fleet. They tried to design it so that it would approach the ship slower by having airflow blown over the flaps and the slats, which gives it a much more of a lift and a slower speed. But in the process, it takes bleed air off of the compressor of the engine and causes the thrust to be less. And so you got a real dog coming aboard the ship. And because of that characteristic, the people at the Patuxent River Test Center said it wasn't suitable for carrier aviation. And the powers to be bought it and sent it to the fleet anyway. And so I had finagled a set of orders to go to test pilot school in a very short turnaround. And my orders came across the desk of Captain Bob Rasmussen, who was the senior detailer for fighter guys. And he goes, "That's Hot Dog Brown. He's a Crusader LSO. Do not pass go, do not collect $200, go straight to Miramar and take over the training of the carrier aviation guys and teach them, including the LSOs, how to bring this aircraft safely aboard the ship, even though the test pilot guys say it's not suitable." Well, I got there and they went, "Hey, Hot Dog, here's the old fighter guy, you know, 2 combat tours, automatically I'm in operations as a combat flight instructor. So I got 2 roles, major roles there. And I knew all the guys in there. And I was about ready to make lieutenant commander at the time. And so I was one of the senior guys in there. And they put together this little cadre of guys working with the 121 guys. I wasn't actually one of those guys doing all that work. I was in ops working with those guys, feeding them the information they asked us for. And then we'd red team, what they came up with. And, it was a good thing. It was a good thing for all of us. When you talk about things, it becomes more clear. I mean, it's nothing more clear than thinking you're the world's greatest fighter pilot and then coming to the training squadron, the RAG as we call it, the replacement air group, and then trying to teach somebody who just came from the training command with bright-eyed and bushy-tailed what the Crusader is all about, how best to fly it, and how best to fight it. You think you know a lot, and you do, but then not being able to articulate that in an instructor mode tells you how much you really don't know about the airplane you've been flying for 2 or 3 or 4 years.
Having someone come occasionally who likes a headline.
We'd have instructor meetings and say, geez, I got this question today, and everyone goes, oh God, I'm glad I didn't get that, And so you'd go into the books. You had tech reps, technical representatives from the different airframes. The engine guys, would come in and talk to you about the engines. They'd come in and talk about the airframes. They'd come in and talk to you about the weapons in a technical sense, so that you actually knew how these things worked. You weren't just guessing, or you weren't just trying to teach somebody because you had 1,000 hours more than he had. What you do in this school is it stands to reason that if you're an instructor, you're better than the student. So the student doesn't learn anything if you go out there and kick him every time he flies, all right? You got to dangle the bait out there. You got to show him what you're trying, you do the classroom work, and we use stick airplanes and show the different angles off and maneuverability. We go over the maneuverability characteristics, the diagrams, the VN diagrams, if you will, of each particular airplane. And it changes as you burn off fuel. You're more maneuverable with less fuel. And so you have to have an awareness of what your envelope looks like if you're at 30,000 pounds versus 25,000 versus 20. Your maneuverability changes. And you don't think about that when you're a nugget flying around. You know that because you learn it when you're an instructor. You go, geez, I got to teach these guys how to do this. And oh, wow, this is what the airplane looks like on paper when it's at 25,000 pounds gross weight. Because the thrust is always the same, and the airframe is always the same. So your speed and acceleration is less when you're heavier. So it stands to reason you're less maneuverable when you're heavier. It takes a special kind of guy, I think, to be an instructor, because you got to put your ego in your back pocket, because you don't know everything. And for you to take a student out and say, okay, we're going to go fly one-on-one, and then he goes and makes a big error or something like that relative to what you would do, and then you end up in 2 turns and it's 6 o'clock, and you go, see, you're an idiot. He didn't learn anything, because you're expected to be that much better than him. But you go 16 flights down the line as an instructor, and you're doing your job. When he's down at that last graduation ceremony flight against you, he's out there to show you he can beat you. And sometimes they do, because you've taught them well if they can beat you. And that's what the goal is. The goal is not to go out there and beat them every time. The goal is to go out there and teach them how to beat you.
American fighter pilots struggled greatly to tell apart allies from enemies in Vietnam's jungles and rice paddies. To clear the confusion of battle, hundreds of FACs flew over the countryside in light, unarmed planes, identifying enemy spots with marker rockets and guiding follow-up air attacks. FACs didn't get the same attention as pilots flying fast.